Hey everybody, Mean Joe from Legend Hobby. Welcome to part 2 of the Maxi Lift assembly video. In this episode, we're going to be covering how to get her on our main gear, and we're also going to talk about how to get some of the servos installed. Specifically, we're going to work on the elevator servos on both sides and the rudder servo. Stay tuned. Here we go. Okay, so the next step in the process is going to be to put together your gear and your wheels for your main gear. Once we're done, it's going to look like this, and I will show you how I got to that. So a couple of things you're going to want to gather is you're going to want to gather a 13 millimeter socket, 13 millimeter open end and box end. You're going to want a screwdriver. This happens to be a P2 by 100. And then I have my 1.5 millimeter. This is going to be for the set screws, and a 5.5 millimeter opened end for putting the bolts and screws onto the tires. Now there's a couple of things in the manual I wanted to point out. You'll notice in the manual that they leave quite a gap. So on the manual here, let me see if I can show you the manual picture. On the manual picture here, when you have the tire on, it shows quite a bit of a gap right there. I didn't leave that much of a gap, so when I get to that spot I will actually show you what I did. But the whole process of putting this together is actually pretty simple. The other thing I wanted to point out is that your tire has the wheel and tire hardware with it. The pieces that you don't need for this are here. So you have your brass fitting to put air in your tires, you have your extra rod here and an extra wheel collar. You won't need those for this step. I just go ahead and put them aside, and you'll be dealing with the parts that you have that you see here. The first thing that you'll do is you'll take your axle and go ahead and put a wheel collar, and what I did was I put my wheel collar all the way down. I used my 1.5 millimeter Allen wrench, or ball driver I should say, and then I go ahead and I use some of the Zap Z42 thread locker, the blue, on this part because you don't want those set screws to pull out easily, and the blue thread locker is good enough that it holds it. It's a medium strength, so it'll hold it nice and tight, but you'll also be able to get it out later if for some reason you need to do some maintenance on your wheels. You'll still be able to get this apart without much issue. So go ahead and put your wheel collar all the way down against the top of the axle. Get it nice and tight. And then what I do is I just dab away the blue that's on there, just because it gets a little messy when you drive the screw. Okay. Then the next part is your wheel hub. You'll put your wheel hub on with it facing the axle, the opened end facing the axle. So bring that down, and what I do on mine, or what I did on mine, was I put it right up against the wheel collar. So you can see that here, because I don't want there to be a lot of space there where this can move around. Now the next step is going to be to add the other wheel collar. This is where I vary a little bit from the pictures, because in the pictures there's quite a gap. What I'm doing is I'm sliding it all the way down against the hub, the inner wheel hub. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure when I put the screw in, when I put my driver in, I'm just making it so my driver will fit. So I'm using that as my gauge, and that's going to open it a little bit, but not much. In the pictures they show it way out here. That's not going to make your wheel want to fit very good. So bring it down to where the driver is just touching the inside of the wheel hub, and that's going to be where I put mine. I'm going to go ahead and take that set screw out of there. Put a little bit of the Z42 blue medium thread locker on there. Insert it into the wheel collar without dropping it. There's still plenty of blue on there because it was actually down inside the hole, so I don't need to reapply that. Make sure you don't cross thread these, so if it feels like it's going to cross thread, just pull it back and restart it. These things are kind of a pain if you get them cross threaded. Get it started nice and straight, and then I'm just bringing that down to where my driver touches the inside of my hub, and I'm tightening it up there. What that does is that allows me the ability to be able to get back to it later, so there's plenty of space there. And actually, before that hardens, I think I'm even gonna I moved that a little bit, so I want to bring that down just a little bit more even to there. There you go. And that'll give you a little bit of play, but not an overabundance of play. Now, this next part is probably the most difficult part of this whole thing because of the fiddly little screws and nuts that are here. These are just 5.5 millimeters, so they're very small. You want to make sure that your fill nozzle faces away from your gear. So this part goes in the gear and this part goes out. So you want to make sure that your wheel faces with the fill nozzle out. Okay. Then you bring in your outer hub, line up your outer hub, and this is where it gets a little tricky, because to get this to line up so that you can put your bolts and or nuts and screws on, you have to squeeze this at the same time. So how I did this was this: I put my screw through, I squeezed it through the back side so I can see it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of blue to the end of this. Just a little bitty tiny bit. And then if you lay your bolt down or your nut down, just a little bit tough to do. Once you get it there, you can hold it with your finger and use your screwdriver to start it. And then once you get the first one started, the rest of them are much easier. There, now that I've got that on there, I can go ahead and use my screw while I hold my pressure. Again, you want to make sure that you don't cross thread these. And then once you get the first one in, the rest of them are a lot easier. You don't have to squeeze quite as hard. Again, go ahead and put just a little dab of blue. And the reason I'm putting the blue Loctite on there is because I don't want a lot of issues with the wheels getting loose. And because of the gas engine on this one, the vibration can sometimes cause these little screws to come a little loose. And I don't want to have to disassemble the entire wheel to fix it. Plus that keeps me from losing the parts as well. And you're just going to go around the wheel and do the rest the same. The more screws you have in it, the easier it is to get them on there for the next ones, because it's compressing the wheel, so you're not having to try to squeeze the same time you're trying to draw your screws in. Again, you want to be very careful that you don't cross thread these. That will just create a nightmare later. And this part here is literally the worst part of putting these wheels together. And then once you get all 4 in, then you just go through and use your 5.5 millimeter open end wrench and snug them up nice and tight. You'll go around and do that same thing to all 4. One of the things that you might notice from my tools is I really like these vessel screwdrivers. They're a little bit more expensive than traditional screwdriver sets, but they also last a long time, and they come in all the sizes that we as hobbyists need. And they're very nice. I like these. I've used these for years. So now that we have all 4 of the screws and nuts put on, we can move on to the next step, which is going to be to attach our axle to our gear. So all you simply do is put the axle through. Whoops. Don't do what I almost did and forgot your washer. So you'll want to put a washer in there. Then go ahead and put your wheel on. These are tight enough that I found that you do have to kind of screw them on there. And then what I did was I went ahead and put the lock nut on there. I'm not going to put Loctite on these because this is a nylon lock nut. Then I'm going to use my 13 millimeter open end wrench from the back side and my 13 millimeter driver. And I'm just going to tighten this all the way down. Nice and snug. Then that part is on. And then you have your little cap that goes on there. Now you can put some adhesive on those. They're just snap fit, so you just kind of work around until it snaps on there. And they should stay on there pretty good, but I think for mine I'm going to put a little bit of maybe some fill gap or something in there in a couple spots just to make sure that it doesn't fall off on me. But those should be good. Now your main gear is ready to install to your airframe. So the next step is pretty simple. We're just going to attach the main gear to the fuselage. You've got your 4x20 inch bolts and a washer. Just finger start those. And then your 3 millimeter driver. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just test fitting this to make sure everything seems like it's going to fit good. And right now it seems like it is. So I'm going to go ahead and put some blue Loctite on these again. I've got my Zap Z42 blue medium thread locker. I'm going to go ahead and place some of that on each screw, because again, we don't want this gear coming off while we're in the air or on the ground. Go ahead and get that one started. Then we can pull this one out and place some blue thread locker on it as well. You'll notice this is slotted, so I'm going to slide it out so it aligns with the side of the fuselage. And then I'm going to go ahead and tighten my screws down. I get them down pretty snug before I really tighten them, so that way nothing moves or shifts while I'm tightening them down. You don't want to go too crazy on this kind of stuff. Just a good snug is plenty. And then we're going to do the same thing to the other side. We're going to attach or add a little bit of blue thread locker to the first screw. Put our gear in place. Go ahead and get that finger started on there. Same thing for the other side. And we'll take our 3mm driver and snug these down. And now the main gear is in place. Now we can move on to installing servos in the fuselage. So since we're doing some servo installation, I wanted to take some time to show you guys how these work. A lot of people do this backwards, so I wanted to make sure I pointed this out. On these Hitec servos, the servo grommets are designed to take the vibration out of the servo from anything you might get from the engine or from the motor, depending on whether you're setting up gas or electric, whichever. You may have some vibration that would adversely affect the servos, so that's what these grommets are for. So one of the things you'll notice while working on these Hitec servos is they have a little notch. Almost looks like an I-beam on the end. That notch goes facing out, away from the servo. That fills this gap right here between the arms. So when you put these together, those will fit perfectly in that direction. Once you get your grommet in place and everything is good to go, this is the part that people do backwards sometimes. These little brass grommets with the flange go on the bottoms of the servo. This just makes sure that when you attach the servo to the mounting bracket, that you have a solid surface going between your mounting bracket and your servo. So these go on the bottom. Once you have your grommet in place, you simply just push the brass flange down inside there. Sometimes you got to mess with them a little bit because the rubber moves. But then once you get those on here, these are how these flanges get installed. These go on the bottom of the servo, not the top. So one of the things that I noticed on my elevator servo trays is they're just a little bit too short. The servo won't quite fit down inside the tray. You can see here it's hanging up on the triangle stock here on this side, which is an easy fix. I've already marked where I need to cut to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my Zona saw, and I'm going to cut a spot out of the servo tray so that my servo will fit. This happens once in a while because of all the different variety of servos that are out there. They want to make sure that it fits most, and with this being a standard size servo, it's almost there, but you just need to cut a section out to make it fit. You'll want to check this with your servos to see if yours fit when you get it, but I'm going to make this modification and then we'll move on to getting this installed on the airframe. So a couple of things that I do when I'm installing servos. First is I swap out the stock hardware. I've never liked these for servo installation. I always have trouble with the ends stripping out. So I go ahead and swap these out with my micro Fasteners servo screws. And one of the things that I always make sure I do is I'm going to run each screw down and get the location set properly and make sure everything's all good to go. And then what I will do once I get all 4 screws in, again, as I showed earlier, I pilot drilled these so they would start easy. Once I get these all in, what I will do is I will take all of the screws out, and then I will go back in and I will put thin CA down inside the holes for each servo screw, so that gives it some more strength. So go ahead and install all your servo screws, and then once you get them in there, take them out and put some thin in there, and they will be a lot stronger in the end. So one of the things that I also like to do on an installation like this, you can see that my left side elevator servo is already all set up, and I know that I'm going to have an extension. So what I use are little zip ties. I know that there's a lot of folks that like to use the clips, and those are just fine. You can also get your servo extensions with clips installed on them from the factory, but I just like to use these little small little zip ties. And what I do is I place the zip tie on the wire, and then I go ahead and connect my extension, make sure my polarity is all lined up correctly, and then I just run the little zip tie around the other side, and then I just tighten it up. Simple, easy. I keep a lot of these on hand, so it works perfectly. And there's no way that that servo extension wire is ever going to come apart. I get it as tight as I can so it doesn't make a mess. And I simply just clip off the end. And that extension is not going anywhere. It'll stay connected. Okay, so one of the things that's handy to have is a piece of kite string. And just tie a washer to the end of that. So what I'm going to use this for is to pass the servo extension up through the fuselage. And with the fuselage this side, it's really pretty simple. You just take a magnet. I got an extendable magnet here, run it up through the fuselage, grab it on the other end, and now I have the string made through the fuselage. So then all I have to do is tie that to the servo extension and pull it through. It's a really simple process. It's really simple to do. Just tie a little knot in the end. Doesn't have to be anything crazy. I always keep a little roll of tight kite string in my shop. Then I just tie the end to the servo extension. You don't have to do anything crazy, just really one loop around. You don't have to tie it very tight. And then just pull the servo extension through the fuselage so that you can connect it to your receiver. Now I have my servo extension out the other end. I can go ahead and place my servo block back in its location. And the next thing we're going to do is drill out our holes for our servo block so that we can install our screws. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get our hatch installed here. I've already pre-drilled these holes, and I'm going to do the same thing with these that I did with the servo screws earlier. I'm going to get them installed, then I'm going to take them back out and put a little thin CA in the holes. Again, this strengthens the wood around where the screw's at and makes it so these screws won't as easily vibrate out while you're flying your models. Make sure you take note that the servo arm is on the bottom for the elevators. This is where it will be located so that you can hook it up to the control rods and a few more steps. Now we can move on to the other side. It'll be the exact same process. And once you get through that, we'll move on to the next step. So now moving on to the rudder servo. What I noticed on mine is that the servo bay is just a little bit too small for the standard servo to fit. It's really, really close. So I'm going to take some material out here so that I can get this to fit. And then I'm going to follow the same process that I did on previous servos. I'm going to run in the screws, pre-drill the holes, run in the screws, take them back out, put a little thin down in the hole, and then mount the servo. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Make sure you stay tuned for the next time when we're going to start talking about installing our switches, and we're going to get the engine mounted to the firewall. As always, thank you very much for watching, and have a legendary day.